The morning mist hung heavy over the Scottish Highlands as Inspector Margaret Thompson adjusted her uniform collar and checked her watch. 23 years she had served the Royal Protection Unit, and never once had she questioned an order from above. Today felt different. The radio crackled to life on her shoulder as she stood at the gates of Balmoral Castle, the late Queen's beloved Scottish retreat. All units be advised. The Queen Consort will be arriving at 1400 hours for extended residence in the East Wing, came the voice of her superior, Commander Hayes. Margaret's jaw tightened. The East Wing, the very section of Balmoral that had been sealed off since the Queen's passing just over a year ago. Those rooms held more than furniture and paintings. They contained the essence of a monarch who had ruled for 7 decades. The Queen's private study, her personal sitting room, even her bedroom remained untouched, preserved exactly as she had left them on her final visit. The other guards exchanged glances. Sergeant James MacLeod, a burly Scotsman who had protected the royal family for 15 years, shook his head slowly. "That's not right, Inspector. Those rooms were declared off-limits by His Majesty himself. Sacred ground, he called them." Margaret had been present during that conversation between the new king and the estate manager. The grief in the monarch's voice had been unmistakable as he requested that his mother's private quarters remain undisturbed. It was to be a place of remembrance, a sanctuary where her memory could rest in peace. The decision had been unanimous among the royal household staff. No one would enter those rooms without explicit permission from the king himself. As the afternoon sun began to pierce through the clouds, a convoy of black vehicles wound its way up the castle's long driveway. Margaret watched through her binoculars as the Queen Consort emerged from the lead car, flanked by her own security detail and several household staff carrying luggage. There was something different about her demeanor today, a determination that seemed to cut through the Highland air like a blade. Lady Catherine Ashworth, the castle's head housekeeper for 30 years, approached Margaret with obvious distress written across her weathered face. "Inspector, I've received direct orders to prepare the East Wing for occupancy, but surely there's been some mistake. Those rooms haven't been touched since Her late Majesty's passing." The weight of the situation settled on Margaret's shoulders like a heavy cloak. She had sworn an oath to protect the royal family, but what happened when that protection extended to preserving the memory of those who had passed? The Queen Consort was now approaching the castle's main entrance, her entourage in tow, seemingly unaware of the emotional earthquake her arrival was causing among the long-serving staff. Margaret's radio buzzed again. "Inspector Thompson, escort Her Majesty to the East Wing. Full security protocol." Her finger hesitated over the response button. In all her years of service, she had never felt such internal conflict. The order was clear, but it felt like a betrayal of something sacred. The other guards looked to her for guidance, their faces reflecting the same mixture of duty and unease that she felt coursing through her veins. "Roger that," she finally responded, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. As she walked toward the castle's entrance, Margaret couldn't help but remember the last time she had seen the late Queen in these very halls. It had been during the summer before her passing, and the monarch had been sitting in her favorite chair by the window in the East Wing's sitting room, reading correspondence and occasionally glancing out at the gardens she had loved so dearly. The Queen had noticed Margaret standing guard and had offered her customary warm smile, asking about her family and thanking her for her dedicated service. Now, those same rooms were about to be occupied by someone else, and the very thought made Margaret's stomach churn. She understood that life moved forward, that the royal family must adapt and continue their duties despite personal loss. But there was something about the timing and manner of this occupation that felt wrong, as if an unspoken agreement was being shattered. The Queen Consort entered the castle with purposeful strides, her heels clicking against the stone floors that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Margaret fell into step behind her, maintaining the professional distance required by protocol while battling the growing sense of unease that threatened to overwhelm her composure. Other staff members lined the corridors, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes betraying the shock and dismay they felt. Mrs. Bay, Ashworth had clearly spread word of the intended destination, and the collective intake of breath was almost audible as the small procession made its way toward the East Wing. These were people who had served the royal family with unwavering loyalty, who had mourned the Queen's passing as deeply as if she had been their own family member. As they reached the sealed doors of the East Wing, Margaret found herself hoping for some last-minute reprieve, perhaps a change of heart or a sudden realization of the emotional significance of these particular rooms. But the Queen Consort simply waited expectantly for the doors to be opened, her expression revealing nothing of any internal conflict she might be experiencing. The moment stretched endlessly as Margaret reached for her keys, each second feeling like an eternity. Behind those doors lay not just rooms and furniture, but the preserved essence of a beloved monarch's final days at her cherished Highland retreat. Once opened, something would be lost forever, something that could never be recovered or restored. The key turned in the lock with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire castle, and Margaret knew that this moment would haunt her for the rest of her career. As the doors swung open, revealing the unchanged rooms beyond, she caught a glimpse of the late Queen's reading glasses still sitting on the side table, exactly where they had been left over a year ago. The sight hit her like a physical blow, and she had to steady herself against the doorframe. The Queen Consort stepped forward into the sacred space, and Margaret followed reluctantly, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had just participated in what felt like the desecration of a shrine. The radio on her shoulder crackled with routine updates from other parts of the estate, but the words seemed to come from another world entirely, a world where duty and emotion didn't clash so violently within the confines of one's chest. As furniture covers were removed and luggage was brought in, Margaret stood at attention, fulfilling her duty while privately mourning the loss of something intangible but infinitely precious. The transformation had begun, and there would be no turning back from this moment that would forever change the sacred atmosphere of Balmoral's East Wing. 3 days had passed since the Queen Consort's arrival at Balmoral, and the atmosphere among the security detail had grown increasingly tense. Inspector Margaret Thompson found herself checking and rechecking protocols, searching for any regulation that might support her growing conviction that something fundamentally wrong was happening within the castle walls. Sergeant McLeod approached her during the evening shift change, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by barely contained frustration. "Inspector, the lads are talking. They're saying this isn't right. And honestly, I'm finding it hard to disagree with them. Mrs. Ashworth told me they've moved the Queen's personal Bible from the bedside table. That book hadn't been touched since the funeral preparations." Margaret's hands clenched involuntarily. She had heard similar reports throughout the past few days. Personal items relocated, furniture rearranged, and most disturbingly, several of the late Queen's private photographs removed to make space for new decorations. Each change felt like another small betrayal of the promise to preserve these rooms as they had been during the monarch's final visit. The situation became more complicated when word arrived that several members of the royal household staff had submitted formal complaints through proper channels. Cook Morrison, who had prepared the Queen's meals for over 2 decades, had been particularly vocal about her distress. She had specifically requested that the East Wing's small kitchen remain exactly as the Queen had left it, with her favorite tea service still arranged on the counter. Now, those same cups and saucers had been packed away to accommodate different preferences. Margaret's walkie-talkie buzzed with an incoming message from Commander Hayes. "Thompson, report to my office immediately. We need to discuss the current situation." The walk to the security office felt longer than usual, and Margaret found herself rehearsing potential responses to questions she knew were coming. Commander Hayes had been with the Royal Protection Unit for nearly 30 years, and his loyalty to the institution was beyond question. However, Margaret suspected that he too was struggling with the current circumstances. "Close the door, Inspector," Hayes said without looking up from the paperwork scattered across his desk. His gray hair seemed to have acquired more silver streaks in just the past few days, and the lines around his eyes appeared deeper than Margaret remembered. "Sir, if this is about the staff complaints, it's about more than complaints, Thompson." Hayes finally raised his eyes to meet hers. "I've received a call from the palace. Apparently, word has reached certain ears about the, shall we say, adjustment period we're experiencing here at Balmoral. The powers that be are concerned about maintaining discretion and avoiding any public relations difficulties." Margaret felt her stomach drop. The idea that their internal struggles might become public knowledge filled her with dread. The royal family had endured enough scrutiny and controversy in recent years, and the last thing anyone wanted was a media circus surrounding the occupation of the late Queen's private rooms. "What are our orders, sir?" Hayes sighed deeply before responding. "We're to maintain absolute professionalism and ensure that all staff members understand the importance of discretion. Any further complaints are to be handled through internal channels only, and under no circumstances should these matters be discussed outside the immediate household." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Lady Catherine Ashworth entered without waiting for permission, her usual composed demeanor cracked with obvious distress. "Commander Hayes, Inspector Thompson, I apologize for the intrusion, but I must speak with you both immediately. There's been a development that requires your urgent attention." Margaret exchanged a glance with her superior before Hayes gestured for the housekeeper to continue. "This morning, while performing routine maintenance in the East Wing, one of my staff discovered that several items from Her late Majesty's personal collection have gone missing. Specifically, a small silver photograph frame containing an image of the late Prince Philip, and a handwritten letter from the Queen Mother that was kept on the writing desk." The blood drained from Margaret's face. Missing items from the late Queen's personal effects would constitute a security breach of the highest order, and the implications were staggering. Either someone had deliberately removed these precious mementos, or they had been displaced during the recent occupation and reorganization of the rooms. Hayes leaned forward in his chair, his expression grave. "Are you absolutely certain these items were present before the Queen Consort's arrival?" "Without question, Commander. I personally supervised the sealing of those rooms after Her late Majesty's passing, and I documented every item that remained in place. Those pieces were specifically noted in my records because of their sentimental value." Margaret's mind raced through the possible explanations. The security protocols for the East Wing had been maintained throughout the Queen Consort's occupation, and no unauthorized personnel had been granted access. This meant that either the items had been moved by someone with legitimate access, or they had been accidentally displaced and misplaced during the reorganization process. "I need to interview everyone who has entered those rooms since the Queen Consort's arrival," Margaret said, her professional training taking over despite her personal emotions. "Staff members, security personnel, anyone who might have inadvertently moved or handled those items." Lady Ashworth nodded grimly. "I've already begun preliminary inquiries with my housekeeping staff. They all deny any knowledge of the missing items, and I believe them implicitly. These are people who would rather resign their positions than risk damaging anything belonging to Her late Majesty's memory." The weight of the situation settled over the three of them like a suffocating blanket. Margaret realized that they were now dealing with more than just emotional discord among the staff. They were confronting a potential scandal that could have far-reaching consequences for the royal family's reputation. Hayes stood up slowly, his joints creaking audibly in the sudden silence. "Inspector Thompson, I want you to conduct a thorough but discreet investigation. Interview everyone, search every possible location, and leave no stone unturned. Lady Ashworth, please provide Inspector Thompson with your detailed inventory records and any other documentation that might be relevant. As Margaret prepared to leave the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of a precipice. The missing items could potentially be recovered, but the trust that had been broken among the long-serving staff members would be much more difficult to restore. The sacred nature of the East Wing had already been compromised, and now its security had been called into question as well. Walking through the castle corridors toward the East Wing, Margaret passed several staff members who avoided making eye contact with her. The news of the missing items had clearly spread quickly through the household grapevine, and the atmosphere of unease that had pervaded the castle since the Queen Consort's arrival had now transformed into something approaching genuine alarm. Standing before the doors to the East Wing once again, Margaret steeled herself for what promised to be one of the most challenging investigations of her career. Somewhere within these rooms that had once represented peace and continuity lay the answers to questions that no one really wanted to ask, and solutions to problems that should never have existed in the first place. The investigation had consumed the better part of 2 days, and Inspector Margaret Thompson felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders like never before. Every interview had been conducted with meticulous care, every room searched with respectful thoroughness, and every possible explanation explored with professional determination. Yet the missing items remained elusive, and the tension within Balmoral Castle had reached a breaking point. Margaret sat in her temporary office, reviewing the witness statements and evidence logs for what felt like the 100th time. The silver photograph frame and handwritten letter seemed to have vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that threatened to tear apart the fabric of trust that had held the royal household together for decades. A soft knock interrupted her concentration, and she looked up to see Thomas Hartwell, the Queen Consort's personal valet, standing nervously in the doorway. He was a slight man in his 50s who had served in various royal households for most of his adult life, and his reputation for discretion and competence was beyond reproach. "Inspector Thompson, might I have a word with you privately? I believe I may have information relevant to your investigation." Margaret gestured for him to enter and closed the door behind him. Something in his demeanor suggested that this conversation would be significant, and she prepared herself mentally for whatever revelation might be coming. "Thomas, please sit down and tell me what's on your mind." The valet perched on the edge of the chair across from her desk, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Inspector, I've been struggling with my conscience for the past day, and I've decided that I must speak truthfully about what I witnessed, regardless of the potential consequences." Margaret leaned forward slightly, her pen poised over her notebook. "Please, take your time and tell me exactly what you saw." 2 days ago, while I was attending to Her Majesty's wardrobe in the main bedroom, I observed her removing several items from various surfaces and placing them in a small travel case. At the time, I assumed she was simply rearranging things to her personal preference, which would be entirely within her rights as the occupant of the rooms. The inspector's heart began to race, but she maintained her professional composure. "Can you describe these items in more detail?" Thomas nodded slowly. There was definitely a silver photograph frame, and what appeared to be personal correspondence of some kind. I didn't think anything unusual about it at the moment, as royal family members often travel with personal mementos and cherished items. However, given the current situation, I felt compelled to report what I had observed. Margaret set down her pen carefully, her mind racing through the implications of this testimony. If Thomas was correct, then the missing items hadn't been stolen or accidentally misplaced. They had been deliberately removed by the Queen Consort herself. The question now became whether this action had been taken with full knowledge of the item's significance, or whether it had been an innocent misunderstanding about what belonged to whom. Thomas, I appreciate your honesty in coming forward with this information. I need to ask you to keep this conversation completely confidential while I determine the appropriate next steps. After the valet left, Margaret found herself facing the most delicate situation of her career. Approaching a senior member of the royal family about potentially sensitive matters required careful consideration and adherence to strict protocol. She couldn't simply march up to the queen consort and demand explanations, but neither could she ignore evidence that might resolve the investigation. She decided to consult with Commander Hayes before proceeding further. The walk to his office felt like a journey through treacherous territory, and Margaret rehearsed various approaches to explaining the situation without causing unnecessary offense or embarrassment to anyone involved. Hayes listened to her report with growing concern, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing her to present the facts without interruption. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for several long moments. This is precisely the kind of situation that protocol manuals never adequately address, he said finally. We have credible evidence suggesting that the missing items are in the possession of the queen consort, but we must approach this matter with absolute diplomatic sensitivity. Margaret nodded in agreement. What do you recommend, sir? I think our best course of action is to have Lady Ashworth make a polite inquiry. As head housekeeper, she has legitimate reasons to ask about the location of inventory items, and she can frame the question in terms of ensuring that all of Her late Majesty's belongings are properly catalogued and preserved. The plan was implemented later that same afternoon. Lady Ashworth, drawing upon decades of experience in managing delicate household situations, approached the queen consort during tea time in the East Wing sitting room. Margaret positioned herself within earshot but out of direct view, ready to intervene if the situation became complicated. Your Majesty, Lady Ashworth began with her characteristic diplomacy, I hope you've been comfortable in these rooms. I wanted to inquire about a couple of small items that seem to have been misplaced during the transition. Specifically, a silver photograph frame and a letter that were part of Her late Majesty's personal collection. I'm trying to ensure that all such items are properly accounted for in our records. The queen consort paused in stirring her tea, and Margaret could sense the sudden tension in the air even from her hidden position. Several seconds passed before a response came. Oh yes, those items. I noticed them when I arrived and thought they might be more appropriately preserved with the other personal effects rather than remaining on display. They're safely stored in my travel case for safekeeping. I plan to have them transferred to the proper archival location once I determine the appropriate protocol. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and residual concern wash over her. The items hadn't been stolen or permanently removed, but the fact that they had been taken without consultation with the household staff suggested a fundamental misunderstanding about the significance of preserving the rooms exactly as they had been left. Lady Ashworth maintained her professional composure beautifully. That's very thoughtful of your Majesty. If I might suggest, these particular items held special sentimental value in their original locations. Perhaps we could restore them to their previous positions, while we determine the best long-term preservation approach. The conversation concluded with an agreement to return the items to their original places, and Margaret felt the first genuine sense of relief she had experienced since the investigation began. However, she realized that the underlying tensions that had prompted this crisis remained largely unresolved. Over the following days, a gradual accommodation began to emerge within the castle. The queen consort, perhaps sensing the deep emotional investment that the staff had in preserving certain aspects of the East Wing, made subtle adjustments to her occupancy that showed greater respect for the memory of her predecessor. The missing items were quietly returned to their original positions, and several other changes were made to restore some of the rooms to their previous state. Margaret watched these developments with cautious optimism. The crisis had been resolved without public scandal or lasting damage to relationships, but it had also highlighted the complex emotions and competing loyalties that existed within the royal household. The staff's fierce devotion to the late Queen's memory had clashed with the practical necessities of moving forward, creating tensions that would require time and patience to fully resolve. Standing once again at her post outside the East Wing, Margaret reflected on the lessons learned during this difficult period. Duty and emotion didn't always align perfectly, and sometimes the greatest service one could provide was to navigate the space between competing obligations with wisdom and discretion. The rooms behind those doors would never again hold quite the same sacred atmosphere they had possessed immediately after the Queen's passing, but they could still serve as a bridge between honoring the past and embracing the future. The investigation was officially closed, the missing items recovered, and the household gradually returned to its normal routines. But Margaret knew that the memories of these few intense days would remain with everyone involved, serving as a reminder of how deeply personal connections could become intertwined with professional responsibilities in the unique world of royal service.